this lecture, we will attempt to answer the question, should prostitution be legalized? Well, according to an article by open.lib.umn.edu, prostitution has existed since ancient times, and it has continued throughout the United States long since prostitution was banned in 1920. The legal brothels that now exist in rural countries in Nevada are the exception in this nation, but it's not the rule. Yet prostitution is common outside Nevada, and thousands of arrests occur nationwide for it. As with illegal drugs, as we think about how to deal with prostitution, we should consider both a philosophical question and a social science question. The philosophical question is whether two people should be allowed to engage in a behavior, in this case prostitution, in which both want to participate. Many people may dislike this behavior for various reasons, but is that significant justification for the behavior to be banned if both people, now let's assume they are legal adults, if both people want to engage in it? In this regard, and without at all meaning to equate prostitution with same-sex sexual behavior, an analogy with homosexuality is worth considering. Homosexual sex used to be illegal because many people thought it was immoral. Then the United States Supreme Court finally invalidated all laws against homosexual sex in its 2003 case, Lawrence versus Texas. The majority opinion declared that, and I quote, "The fact that a state's governing majority has traditionally viewed a particular practice as immoral is not sufficient reason for upholding a law prohibiting the practice," end quote. It further asserted, and I quote, "The petitioners are entitled to respect for their private lives. The state cannot demean their existence or control their destiny by making their private sexual conduct a crime. Their right to liberty under the Due Process Clause gives them the full right to engage in their conduct without intervention of the government," end quote. Although the majority opinion specifically said that its decision did not apply to prostitution, a reasonable argument may be made that respect for privacy of sexual conduct also means that prostitution, too, should be legal. Here, it may be argued that prostitution still victimizes and objectifies women even if they want to engage in it. This is a reasonable argument, but there are many occupations that victimize employees, either because the occupations are dangerous, such as coal mining or construction work, or because the job requires objectifying women as sex objects, such as fashion modeling and cheerleading. Now, this is where I want you guys to put on your psychology hats and try to assess the rest of this article. Because hardly anyone would say these occupations should be legal, is it logical to say that prostitution should be legal? So this is where I want you guys really to put on your your thinking caps and think about the subject matter using various forms of psychological perspectives. So, former U.S. Surgeon General Joycelyn Elders thinks it makes no sense to ban prostitution simply because it objectifies women. And I quote, "Why are we so upset about sex workers selling sexual acts to consenting adults?" She goes on to say, "We say that they are selling their bodies, but how different is it from what athletes do? They're selling their bodies. Models, they're selling their bodies. Actors, they're selling their bodies. The social science question concerning laws against prostitution is whether these laws do more good than harm or more harm than good. If they do more good than harm, they should be maintained and even strengthened. If they do more harm than good, they should be repealed. A growing number of scholars believe that the laws against prostitution do more harm than good, and they say that the best way to deal with prostitution might be to legalize and regulate it. Proponents of legalization argue as follows. Although many people cite the horrible lives of many street walkers as a major reason for their support of laws against prostitution, these laws ironically cause the problem that street walkers experience. When U.S. prostitution was legal a century ago in brothels across the nation, brothel prostitutes were safer than street walkers are now. The article goes on to say, prostitutes working today in Nevada's legal brothels are safer than street walkers. Whatever we might think of their behavior, legal brothel workers are relatively safe from being robbed, beaten, or raped, and their required regular medical exams leave them relatively free of sexually transmitted diseases. The health problems and criminal victimization that many street workers experience happen because their behavior is illegal, and legalizing and regulating prostitution would reduce these behaviors, according to the study by Weiser in 2011. Now, in this regard, legalization of prostitution is yet another harm reduction approach to a social problem. Research suggests that under the right conditions, legal prostitution can be organized in a way that increases workers' health, safety, and job satisfaction. Mandatory condom use and other safe sex practices are typical in legal brothels, or so as reported, and the workers face much lower risk of abuse from customers. The article continues. Legalization of prostitution would also yield a considerable amount of tax revenue, as is now true in Nevada. Let's assume that 50 million acts of prostitution occur annually in the United States, to cite our earlier estimate that is probably too low, and that each of these acts cost an average of $30. Putting these numbers together, prostitutes receive $1.5 billion annually in income. If they paid about 1/3 of this amount, admittedly a rough estimate, in payroll taxes, the revenue of state and federal governments would increase by $500 million. Because the tens of thousands of arrests for prostitution and commercialization of vice annually would reduce significantly if prostitution were legalized, the considerable financial savings from this reduction would be used for other pursuits. Legalizing prostitution would add the United States to the lengthy list of other Western nations that have already legalized it. Although their models of legalization vary, the available evidence indicates that legalizing prostitution does in fact reduce many problems now associated with legal prostitution. Again, this is a scholarly article written by open.lib.umn.edu. What do you think? Do you believe that prostitution should be legalized? Do you think this article was biased towards legalizing prostitution based on a federal tax revenue? Do you believe that this act should remain as is? What do you think? Tell me about it. In my next lecture, we will review an account of a real-life prostitute and her pursuit to get out of her life of prostitution.